Okay, thanks so much, Dennis, and hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. As Dennis said, my name's Prue Robey, Director of the Creative Placemaking Lab. At Artscape, it's been my pleasure to work with the conference organisers this year to put this panel together, and I'm thrilled to introduce my friends and colleagues who are going to be joining me on this panel: Jim Mountain, Director of Regeneration Projects, Heritage Canada, the National Trust, and Gabe, Sawhney, with Bridgeable and co-founder of the wonderful Murmur project. So just a couple of comments really to get us going. Over recent years, I think, as we all know, there's been a huge increase in interest in Canada and internationally in creative placemaking. In the mid-2000s at Artscape, we defined the practice in this way, focusing on leveraging the power of the arts to serve a community's interest, but also to build a broader agenda for neighborhood growth, change, and transformation. More recently in the USA, there's been extraordinary interest and public and private investment in creative placemaking through the National Endowment for the Arts Our Town program. And they've tended to build on our Marcusen's definition here, which really, I guess, focuses on the kind of multi-level cross-sector partnerships that can come around placemaking projects to drive change in communities. And of course, ArtPlace America, an extraordinary program funded by, I think, 15 of the largest foundations in the States, which have come together to fund creative placemaking projects across the country. And their focus here, again, is on community vitality and economic development and the power of the arts to drive that kind of development in communities. But I think that last sentence up on the definition from ArtPlace America is really powerful and probably where the three of us come from. It's all about the local. We are talking about placemaking, we're talking about working in local communities, and we're talking about specifically leveraging the power of the arts, creative placemaking, to drive community change. So that's, I think, where we are. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over. We're going to do 3 brief-ish 10-minute presentations, and then we're going to get in front of the table and hopefully open up a conversation with everyone in the room. So to kick it off, I'm going to hand it over to Jim.
Am I on, Ian? Okay. Thank you very much, Prue. It's an honor to be here today with you. It's an honor to be at this table with Prue and Gabe. And I really appreciate and value the work that you all do. I was with the City of Ottawa with a small team there, cultural plan that worked on 2 cultural development plans in the early 2000s and then in 2010 and 11. I've been with Heritage Canada National Trust since January. So what I'm going to present to you today is what we do, but I also want to talk about inviting anyone that's interested in this room with places that you want to work with us. I'm here to offer that kind of connection. We help find money, we help make connections, we help make things work. Before beginning, I just want to give a nod to the fact that we're on the ancestral territory of what we would know here colloquially as the Mohawk people, but Haudenosaunee people. I do value the fact that we are all part of layers of culture and history, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a sec. The one thing I do want to, we have limited time, so I've got lots to talk about, but I want to say too that the essence of what I'm talking about here is that we put in place in communities, towns, cities, regions, an animator kind of person who is somewhat at arm's length, but able to connect with all sectors of the community to do really interesting work, similar to what you saw this morning in Grand Rapids. Stretches boundaries, but also has kind of the sense of legitimacy in a community too. So I'm going to present to you a number of examples of how that is to work and a methodology for what we have worked with over the years that I think provides a framework for doing really interesting things in communities. There's kind of a rural, small town, medium-sized city aspect to this and remote regional approach, but I've also worked with larger cities as well. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all this text, but Heritage Canada National Trust, we do a conference, we do media, we do we launched Doors Open in the country. We talk about the H word, heritage, and it's so different for different people. And I've been at this a long time, and I still have a sense that people think it's just about buildings, or it's just about designated buildings. And each one of you may have a perspective on what that means, but what we broadly define what that means. And basically, it's what we've been handed, what we have as a legacy from previous times, what we value now, that we want to work with and hand over to the future. And there's all kinds of latitude within that definition of what can be achieved. I work particularly with these regeneration initiatives here, the Main Street Initiative, a regional approach, and then I work with post-industrial or institutional complexes similar to, I'm thrilled to be with Artscape because there's some real synergies there with what we're looking at. But I want to talk about concept of place. I began in my early 20s up in Thunder Bay. I was taken out by the archaeologists at the time to this ancient beach line, 7 miles in from Lake Superior. And there on the beach, which was rippled sand, it was being quarried away by some commercial quarry operators. But we were able to see where 10,000 years ago, people sat and worked with these flint projectile and spear points. And there's all this detritus around, we call it, that's archaeological terms, of where they'd sat. And over where Gabe is was another little bunch of flakes, and over here another. And you can imagine 10,000 years ago sitting there with the sun doing this work, and I suddenly had this amazing feeling that we're just here now as a very small part of a long span of human occupation. And every community and every region has that presence in Canada. So I kind of start with that narrative and how we actually work with. So that again is how I look at heritage. And so Heritage Canada National Trust, we work at trying to save places. So we have an endangered places list. We just had nominations go out. I'm on a little committee that we received 60 of these across Canada. When I started my job, I had 80 places contact me about they want help. And it's not just money, they want knowledge and expertise to come in and just kind of do something with these amazing places, including lighthouses. The federal government's decommissioning 450 lighthouse complexes in the country, the Great Lakes and on the coasts, and they're up for art and cultural use and other kinds of uses if you have a business plan. So we're kind of negotiating that with them. This is an example when I first started. I'm really proud of these people. And again, there's a social networking, social media kind of aspect to this. Ross River, Yukon, 5 minutes. And this is a Dene First Nation. This bridge, this longest suspension bridge in North America, it was up for demolition by the Yukon government. So the people there just got together and they decided, we're going to stand in front of the machines and we're going to have an event around that. A little bit of political stuff happening here with, this was the minister at the time. And so there was this distrust. The people went out and they brought the kids in, the elders, and they just started a campaign. It got on Jian Gameshi's queue, got on As It Happens. Several thousand people got on the Facebook page. I actually helped draft a letter from our organization and went to the ministers. And I did a bit of research and found that this was related to World War II and the military effort. And the federal government just put out a program to honor World War II kinds of commemoration. So we linked it into that. They went and had a festival on the ice. They did curling. They did an art project. And then it turned it around. And so they've actually saved the bridge. But they're not letting up. They're still out there. They still don't quite trust the government. So it's an example of saving a place. I'm working with Prince Charles Regeneration Trust, and we went over and did a study tour with them. This is, again, similar to what Artscape does here, and it was really amazing. We just met last week with this organization in the U.S. There's 27,000 religious places that are kind of in various states of either decline or in some cases they've been abandoned. So this is a non-denominational group that kind of takes those, and there's a big take-up in the U.S. from the arts and cultural community for these found spaces as amazing uses. So we're kind of working with that. I teach at Carleton University at the School of Architecture. I really value working with students, taking them out, the power of visual design in communities to kickstart ideas, similar to what Rob had this morning. There's a lot of energy there and a lot of connections with communities in terms of they want to work with students. And then Main Street. We've had over 300 communities in Canada. There's a lot of stats there about how it works. The US founded in the 2008 downturn Main Street communities that developed this methodology of a person in a storefront office working with all sectors of the community, really picked up and allowed those communities to sustain themselves through that downturn. And there was a study that just came out that really validates that. So again, there's a whole bunch of stuff we do. I work with communities for a whole year to get them ready for that, and then we want to develop a long-term relationship with places to actually do this kind of work. We think we understand places, but I do know that communities, they're the ones that know what they want to do. We help to unlock that through a number of different ways. And there's been a lot of decline, and we have a very positive approach to this. It's taking those opportunities, taking off the slip covers of buildings in some cases, revealing what's there. I just heard on the way over yesterday, CBC's Spark was talking about the network city. So we have physical places in our downtowns and so many different layers of ways to come in, and it's going to be changing as time goes on. This Walmart in Carleton Place was building on the edge of town. They put their storefront hiring office right on the street in a vacant store. So you get these forces at work in our communities, and we're trying to work with all of those things, and it can be done. I go into schools, we do visioning projects with the elementary schools right up through high school, engage the youth, bring them all together in a room like this, paper the walls with ideas, figure out where you want to go as a community, and there we go. And I worked in this little town myself. This is where I developed. I had a design studio. I had a file in every building. We worked with about 40 to 60 buildings. Got an old theater that was mothballed. It's now the Empress Theater. You can go on there and see some amazing stuff they're doing in film and live theater. There was a lot of there was two solitudes there with the two First Nations, and the merchant said, you got to clean up this town. I had syringes in my door in the mornings. I had people that were on the streets with a lot of substance abuse. I got to know them, and we started to turn around through a cultural lens in terms of making that relationship much better. And then I worked with regions, Labrador Straits, a whole great bunch of stories up there on the coast, small communities. The opening ceremony we had there was 900 people came out to celebrate what they had. It was when the cod fishery went down, we managed to pick that region up, and arts, heritage, culture was the generator for that. And we're working in Saskatchewan. I'm there in 2 weeks, a similar approach, and it's a demonstration project for Saskatchewan. Here's my contact points, and I'd be glad to work with I'm here for the conference. Please come and talk to me. I can tell you lots of stories and talk for hours about this. And I just wanted, if I could, play this one little video of a place in Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, an old hotel that went through a flood, and a family from the Philippines came in and managed to turn that around. So if you indulge me for about 2 minutes, that would be great. Okay.
Hello, I'm Jason Catalasan, one of the owners of Maple Creek Commercial Hotel. It's really a waste for a beautiful town of Maple Creek to lose really a heritage establishment, and maybe like a part of Maple Creek. As for some help from the Main Street program and the Heritage Foundation, so people were really surprised that Filipinos and immigrants like us have the heart to really save the establishment. Even though we're just immigrants here in Canada and very new here in Maple Creek, we were really interested not only for the business but to, as we always say, just to give back to the town of Maple Creek, who really accepted us as their own.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to introduce Gabe Sawhney, my colleague here, and I worked with Gabe a couple years ago on the Murmur project in Ottawa, and it's thrilled to be here today with Gabe. So welcome, Gabe. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Prue, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. So what I'm going to talk about is the area of my work has been kind of at the intersection of creative placemaking and what you might call community technology. And so I'm going to show a few projects that kind of explain a little bit about what I mean by that. In about 10 years ago, I started, along with my friends James Roussel and Sean McAuliffe, a project called Murmur. And Murmur is an oral storytelling project. We call it a participatory documentary where what we do is we record very short, make very short audio recordings of people, regular people, telling stories, short stories, 2 to 3 minutes, about places in the city that are important to them. So that can be anything from, you know, the cafe where they wrote their you know, where they used to do work in university, the first apartment they moved into when they came to the city, the park bench where they fell in love, and at each of those places where we've got where someone has told us a story, we put up a sign like this one that has a telephone number on it. And the idea is, as you're walking around the city and you see one of these signs, you can pull out your cell phone, call the number on the sign, and listen to people's stories about the place where you're standing. The premise behind the project is that every place in the city has these kinds of stories, and everyone, all of us, have stories about some place in the city that's really important to us. And we share these stories with our friends sometimes when they come to visit, or family. But generally speaking, these stories are kind of like locked away in the heads of all of these people who live in the city. And Murmur is for us a way to help share those stories, to get those stories out there, to kind of place them in the city. And you know, we feel that these stories are really important because they really do give us having these stories is really what helps us feel like we belong in a place. Like when we have these stories, when we're able to sort of tour people around and talk about this place and that place, and there's this thing that happened here, that's when we really feel like we're part of, when we feel like we're part of a community. We launched it in Kensington Market in Toronto in July of 2003, and not really knowing what would happen, we put up these signs and, you know, who's going to call, and it turned out people really liked it. People really enjoyed the stories, and in fact we've been since invited to install the project, to collect the stories, post the signs in like dozens of communities in cities across Canada, and in fact in 5 countries and on 3 other continents. So it really got a lot of take-up. It really resonated with people, and that was really exciting for us. The stories are also available you can listen to all of them. There are hundreds of them on the website, which is murmur.info, for all of the cities. I won't play any now because it's easy to it's kind of like one of those Wikipedia black holes you can fall into, and just the stories are great. But I encourage you to check it out. Though the stories really, though, are designed to be heard on site. I mean, in the way that we have the storytellers present the story, it's really designed for someone who's standing there and experiencing the place while they're listening to the story. And I guess, you know, I think one of the reasons why people really like it is that it involves technology, but in a way that's very comprehensible. It's making a phone call. It's quite basic. And from my background is in technology. I understand that world, but I also understand the limits of it when you're trying to have impact in a community. And so, you know, the kind of guideline we used in how we use technology in this project is basically like, if our mom wouldn't use it, we don't do it, and that's been quite good. And my mom has a cell phone now, and you know, and so she's there, not a smartphone yet, but a cell phone. So 10 years later, you know, we're reflecting on the project and what it taught us. about how to use technology in communities to bring people together, and essentially what we do with it next. So the 10 years is a pretty long time in the world of technology. It's also a pretty long time in the world of community art. But the stories resonate as strongly as ever. So while continuing to sort of ponder that, I had an opportunity more recently. Most of my work now is in consulting and service design and experience design. But to do a project with Jane's Walk, I'm going to fast forward. You may be familiar with Jane's Walk. It's an annual festival mostly that's in honor of Jane Jacobs, and it takes the shape of basically walking tours of communities and neighborhoods. Anyone can run a walking tour. That's very much a walking conversation. It's a social experience for the people who work together. There is a tour leader, but there are also like dozens of conversations that are going on at the same time. And so the question but those Jane's Walks happen essentially mostly one weekend per year. And in thinking about how they could scale up the work that they do, one of the questions that they have, which is the question that they came to me with, was, if we were to have a mobile app, which we're not committed to, but if we were to have a mobile app, how would that work? What would that be like? Which is an intriguing question, because Jane's Walk is it's a festival that I love, and it's a format that I love, but it's very much a social experience. It's an in-person experience, and how does that translate into a sort of technologically mediated experience? It's an interesting challenge, and so I'm just going to like sort of fast forward quickly through these slides, but essentially the idea we came up with was Walk Story. It's called Walk Stories, and it's a mechanism that allows people to be sharing stories about places, and specifically like a path that connects those stories and those places to others who may be walking with them, but more likely are experiencing this at a different time, sort of like leaving breadcrumbs of stories through technology that other people can pick up and respond to later. And so in order to really pick up the principles, the strong and really important principles that guide Jane's Walk, and translate that into a technology context, I mean, what that meant to us is that it needs to be a social experience, a connected experience, one that's based on sharing, and one that you can experience using multiple platforms. So whether on the web, on mobile, whatever. And I think that process of translating those values into a digital context is a really interesting one, and one that it makes a lot of sense to involve a lot of people in. That frankly, there are some important questions that are made when we're doing that kind of values translation, that we don't want to leave up to the big technology companies. Then it's important to be involving communities. And frankly, there are a lot of people in our communities now who are very tech savvy and who are really interested in contributing some of that to making their cities better. And so a few other projects that I just want to go through that are not ones that I'm connected to, but that I'm really inspired by are these ones: Open Plans, Good Bomb, Projexity, Neighborland, and Next Door. That some of those are Canadian, some of them are American, but they're all projects that are online, that help people find each other, connect, collaborate, and create online, but that are rooted in real-world communities, that are projects around stuff in physical space. And I'm really inspired by what's going on in these, and they're platforms that are really easy to plug into, and that are getting amazing take-up in communities all over the world. And the last one, I guess, that I'm really inspired by and that I want to share with you is called the Urban Prototyping Festival, which came out of San Francisco. The Gray Area Gray Area is the name of the group, and what they do is they sort of connect technologists and folks who are interested in improving neighborhoods, kind of following the model of hackathons, but applying that to real communities, to physical spaces. And there are all manner of super exciting projects that have come out of that. But the part of it that I'm most excited by is that there are people who voluntarily, as their creative practice, are working to make their communities better. And technology will not solve any of the problems of our communities, but it does present us a new set of tools that we can use creatively. And I think most importantly, it presents an opportunity to engage, especially with young people who find technology really compelling and are really interested in using it for good, for making communities better. So thank you very much. Back to Prue.
Trying to go too fast there. Thanks, Gabe. That was fantastic. When I first moved to Canada, I lived in the Annex, and I think one of the first phone calls I made was to Murmur, and it was a wonderful thing. Okay, I'm going to just press straight on and introduce you to Artscape. Artscape is a not-for-profit urban development organisation that makes space for creativity and transforms communities. Over the past 28 years, we've transformed a portfolio of underutilised buildings and sites across Toronto into dynamic community assets, which have had a big role to play in catalysing some of Toronto's most vibrant creative neighbourhoods. So we've developed and we currently manage 9 arts facilities and about 400,000 square feet of below-market space. Over 1,400 artists and cultural workers live and or work in our spaces, which include artist studios, artist live-work spaces, performance, event, exhibition, rehearsal, meeting, temporary and flexible co-working space. And all of our spaces operate with no subsidy. So each of our properties works on a cost recovery model, and in total, Artscape Inc. receives only 3.5% of its revenues from operational funding. Thank you, City of Toronto. I mean that, thank you very much. That wasn't, I mean, we really are grateful because that's the only operational funding we get, and it's incredibly important to us. Our projects include adaptive reuse projects, like the transformation of these 5 former streetcar repair barns into Artscape Witchwood barns, a community cultural hub that brings the arts environment and community together in 60,000 square feet of space, including rent geared to income, artist live work, artist studios, arts and environmental organisational spaces, a huge event space, and a giant greenhouse. And Artscape Distillery Studios, 58,000 square feet of artist studios and artist retail, performance and rehearsal spaces, which catalysed the reimagining of the derelict Gooderham and Walks distillery, you can see here, into what is now a major cultural tourism destination. We also work with community development and public sector partners to ensure that the arts play a central role in major revitalisation projects. Here in Toronto's Regent Park, we worked with the community, with Toronto Community Housing and with the Daniels Corporation to create a new arts and cultural centre at the heart of this massive revitalisation project, which over 20 years will see a former 100% social housing community, much stigmatised and facing deep social and economic challenges, into a mixed income, mixed tenure and much more dense neighbourhood. Daniels Spectrum is, we say, rooted in Regent Park, but open to the world. In Toronto's West Queen West neighbourhood over 18 years, Artscape has pioneered a range of affordable live-work rental, ownership condos, and community cultural hubs, which have played a big role in catalysing the transformation of what was once a rundown post-industrial downtown neighbourhood into a major centre in Canada for creative and contemporary arts practice. And with projects like Artscape Triangle Lofts, where we created a new model for below-market, affordable live-work condos, and Artscape Young Place, our newest baby, which opened last year, a community cultural hub built out of a former public school. In these kinds of projects, we are anchoring the creative community in this rapidly changing West Queen West neighbourhood and ensuring the arts can continue to have a home in and can continue to contribute to the life and economy of these neighbourhoods over the long term. So back in the 1980s, the challenge of affordability and displacement facing artists in Toronto's downtown really triggered the evolution of Artscape. And we started by providing affordable studios for artists and live-work space in single-purpose facilities. But as you can see, I hope from that quick trot through our projects, they have become far more complex, large-scale and often mixed-use. And we have, since the mid-2000s, been describing our practice as creative placemaking, as I said earlier, leveraging the power of the cultural assets and resources in a community to drive a broader agenda for growth, change and transformation. And our practice really focuses on clustering creative individuals and organizations together in facilities designed to catalyze new creative communities and anchor existing creative communities in neighborhoods they've helped transform, revitalize neighborhoods and build the city as a whole. So our projects are absolutely about the arts, but they're also intended to be about more than that. So we work with this theory of change that by creating affordable, safe, stable, secure, appropriate space for the arts, we can generate these multiple public and private benefits in the social, environmental, cultural, and economic spheres. And although our projects, are physical spaces, in fact, they're really about people. The community members, the artists, the tenants, the funders, the investors, the other stakeholders who come around our projects. So we always build our projects from the ground up in the local community. We engage local community stakeholders and leaders from the outset and work towards the development of a strong shared project vision. We see ourselves as an intermediary, brokering deals and fostering relationships to align the needs and interests of stakeholders from the old silos of public, private, and community. And we found that by aligning these partners around bigger city building agendas, which offer win-win-win solutions to problems that may seem intractable in our city, the apparent differences between these groups can be overcome. And we tenant our projects with organizations and individuals who can see themselves in the vision we've developed with the community and the stakeholders for the project, and who we require to specifically identify what they will contribute to the delivery of that vision. And of course, community stewardship and accountability continues to be crucial throughout the project development and into operations through community stewardship plans and a range of community steering, advisory, and programming governance models. So I know that everyone here believes that the arts have the power to transform the lives of individuals and to transform communities. The challenge we face is how to capture the incredible value that artists bring to our communities and ensure that they share in the value they've helped to create. At the same time, in creative placemaking, we want to ensure that the work we do builds healthy, sustainable places where everybody benefits from community development. And of course, that's easier said than done. We all know that artists have become regarded increasingly as the helpful and cheap shock troops of revitalization, priming downtrodden neighborhoods for development. And of course, when the tipping point is reached and the whole cycle of creative sector displacement starts again, when gentrification prices artists out of their neighborhoods, the very ones they've helped to transform. So how do we balance neighborhood growth and change with the challenges of displacement and gentrification? Because creative placemaking is about change, and cities are also obviously constantly changing. So we need to be smart and engaged if we want to ensure that the social, economic, cultural, environmental changes that we think could be triggered by these kinds of projects and this practice are sustainable and are shared by the whole community. So what lessons have we learned from the past 28 years or so that might be helpful in understanding how to mitigate these challenges and build sustainable communities through creative placemaking? Well, first of all, creating the conditions for artists to thrive is the foundation of our work. And over the years, it's become increasingly evident that our tenants, members, and owners are looking for more than affordable rent in a secure building. And you saw all of those sort of different components pop up, and I won't go through them. But I would say that it is still the case that, for example, our affordable artist studio spaces, our commercial spaces are on average 45% of comparable market rates. Clustering creative people and organizations together creates platforms for networking, knowledge sharing, and creative collaboration between tenants, which they tell us helps build their productivity, practice, and reputation. And our projects, of course, also have a powerful role to play in their wider neighborhoods, catalyzing and supporting a wider creative cluster and the social and economic impacts that they also bring to our neighborhoods. The success of creative placemaking projects is heavily dependent upon collaboration between various civic stakeholders, government, private investment, not-for-profit organizations, artists, citizens groups. And it's the strength and diversity of our collaborations and our ability to align diverse needs and interests to achieve a shared vision which underpins the success of our projects. Getting a cultural facility project, getting any cultural project, but getting a cultural facility project off the ground into development and into sustainable long-term operation is complex, risky, time-consuming, and expensive. And it's really difficult to underestimate the importance of leadership to project momentum and delivery. And that leadership can take many roles. Political champions can play a huge role. The dreamers and the risk takers, the visionary leaders can help really keep a project going when it all looks like it's falling apart. Community leaders and activists are crucial in supporting and driving forward the momentum behind many projects like these. And private sector leaders also can play an important role in offering development capacity, resources, and innovative solutions to the complexities of urban development. And of course, in all of this, there's just a lot of technique and technical stuff that needs to be put together to get these projects off the ground, from the earliest phase of research and development through capital project design and development, funding and financing, to tenanting, property management, and programming. We also create spaces and communities that are welcoming, supportive, and open to a diversity of creative practice, risk-taking, and exploration, spaces that support rather than inhibit creativity. And in fact, it turns out that in order to achieve these kinds of results, we also need to take an approach to facility development that embraces that sense of creativity, out-of-the-box thinking, risk-taking, and silo-busting. And finally, as I think I've already mentioned, our projects secure their financial sustainability, their momentum, their public support by ensuring that an ever-widening circle of partners, stakeholders, community members, supporters, artists are engaged in the project from the outset and can contribute to the development of a shared project vision. And increasingly, we have understood this to be the key to the success of our projects, and it is increasingly the hallmark of our projects. So they're not cookie-cutter projects, as you can see. They all end up looking different. But there is a sort of practice that underpins the way we take them forward. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, we have a bunch of free resources online and other tools and services that you're very welcome to talk to myself or my colleague Barb over here about afterwards. But for now, thank you very much. So we thought we'd break all the rules and come down from the table and open this up to a bit of a conversation with everyone in the room. We've got 15 or 20 minutes, I think. So I do want to thank Gabe and Jim for really charging through the presentations so that we had time for questions or comments. We'd also be really interested to hear about the kind of projects that you've got going in your community as well. So I think there's a roving mic somewhere. For people who have any questions or comments they'd like to. Yeah, right at the back over there. did everyone hear that question? The question was about development charges, and I think the fact that although there has been an attempt from time to time in Ontario to disallow development charges for cultural projects, that's not been successful, and there's no expectation that that would be successful in Ontario in the current time. Well, we can get around it insofar as one of the really, I really meant what I said about the City of Toronto earlier. This is in relation to our work. They are fantastic supporters because they give us operational funding, but they do way, way more than that. Cities can do an enormous amount to facilitate the development of these kinds of projects beyond the traditional capital and operational funding models. And one thing they can do is find the wrinkles in the sort of range of planning and fiscal tools that they have at their disposal to facilitate the development of projects. So although we can't get around development charges, there may be ways in which we can partner with developers and we can redirect some of those development charges toward the capital portion of the project, for example. And if your city is prepared to put the kind of expertise in place at the City of Toronto, we have a senior cultural planner who can facilitate a lot of these conversations, then it's possible to kind of look for those kinds of tools to help things along. But it's a challenge, absolutely. Other questions for Gabe or Jim, or comments about your own practice? Someone got, oh, right, the mic's arrived.
Yeah.
Would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Oh, I'm Lucille Bish from the region of Waterloo. I've just always been interested in the Murmur project, but I've never really looked into the technology behind it, or how you would perhaps engage that in your community.
So the technology behind it, I guess there's sort of two parts. There are the really cheap audio recorders that we use to go around and record stories with people. There's the very free software we use to edit the stories once we've got them in the computer. And then there's the comparatively cheap phone system which powers it in the back. That's the computer that people call into. And what we were, initially we used something that was quite complex and expensive, but we very soon figured out that some new technologies like voice over IP actually make that incredibly easy and cheap to set up. So it took us a little while to get there, but ultimately the technology part is this may be surprising, but the technology part is really not the expensive part of the project. It's if any part of the project is expensive, which I don't think it is, it's much more about organizing communities, about getting the message out, about sort of getting out into the neighborhood and finding people who are willing to share their stories, and then letting people know about them, about it when it's up, once it's up, putting up the signs, distributing those postcards with those maps that I showed. So it's not a costly project in terms of dollars, but it is time consuming.
It's very quiet in here. Is everyone hungry? Yeah. I have a question. If nobody else is, while you're thinking about a question, I have a question for Jim about the Main Street project. And you were telling us a lot about a lot of projects. I think I'm really, really interested in the sort of evolution of that project right now in Canada and the work that you're doing. And so it'd be helpful to maybe for people to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay, thanks. As I said, I've just started back in January to kind of reinvigorate a program that was around in the 80s and 90s. It still is actually a Rue Principale en Québec, avec la Fondation Rue Principale. They've been working in over something like 220 communities in Quebec. Alberta has a program of about close to 30 communities, and then in Saskatchewan, where Dennis's Sask Culture and the province has been working with 4 pilot projects there. Maple Creek was one of the pilot projects. And so what I'm coming back into this now is to work within those existing programs, but then kind of rebuild a network across the country. And so kind of, you know, like the Artscape model, which is so in sync with what we're trying to do, where we have body of expertise and knowledge to come into communities, but work with finding the fundraising, doing the fundraising aspect to help communities take on a project like this. I'm really open to any ideas about that from here. And so we help put that together. And basically, what we want is an animator coordinator in a community that can build that collaborative kind of approach to working with the physical, the intangible, the cultural, the economic side, the social side, the environmental side as well. And the other thing I want to put out here to all of you is that we want to put together kind of a mentoring team in a sense. And if you're interested in getting out of your community for a week, I can take you to the far north or the west or the east. Your expenses would be covered. So we have this model coming out of the UK Trust where there's sort of a bit of pro bono work that happens, but we cover costs. Like we're into that idea right now too, because as much as anything else, communities really want, well, first of all, they like being part of a family of projects like this, and they like to be part of something national, but still it's community-led, community-driven, and arts, heritage, culture is at the focal point of that. So all of you have amazing knowledge, wisdom, experience, and energy that I think would be amazing to kind of, you know, help other places and within yourselves too. So it's our idea as a national network is to you know, provide the stories, the lessons coming out of these projects, to help find the money, to help do some training, and help, you know, activate this. There's no one single source anymore like there was in the 80s and 90s. We had $7 million from Industry Canada to do this. We spent $1 million on training. That is not there anymore. So it's all partnership based, and we make it work very creatively, however we can do it. So, and then the regional idea kind of extends out of that. Yeah, that's
Okay, over here. I think there's a mic just running towards you, and if you could introduce yourself.
I'm Laurie Seligman. I'm the Director of Cultural Services for the teeny little city of Spruce Grove, Alberta. My question's on Artscape. Is Artscape, really basic, is it a corporation that actually owns these 9 buildings? And does that mean that it's a hedge against the gentrification because nobody can ever kick you out?
That's a really good question. So actually it's a mix, and that's been a challenge. It is a challenge. So we have had in the early days some of our earliest properties, I mean going back long before my time, we leased cheap and carved up into studios. I mean, the really traditional artist studio model, you know, absolutely everywhere internationally. And of course, as land values rose in those communities, we could no longer afford to be in them. And so we had some of those. We have some properties which we lease from the City of Toronto on extended leases. So, for example, at Artscape Witchwood Barns, we lease for 50 years for $1 a year. And in return for that, we took on that derelict site, raised the money, redid it. We do the whole thing soup to nuts, so the city has no additional costs with respect to that site anymore. So we can do some long-term leases. But absolutely, ownership, I mean, getting into that ownership position is critical for the reason you mentioned, because it assures that we can put down roots in a community and stay there and be a sort of, you know, the anchor when things change. It also, of course, gives us a covenant, and it makes our ability to take new projects forward easier as well. It's easier to get loans and things like that. So Artscape Young Place, we own 80% of that. We actually expected to own 100% of that. We bought it, but in order to make the math work, we've actually done a small number of ownership commercial studios there. But we basically own that project. We own a number of the condos as rental condos in Artscape Triangle Lofts. So we're moving in that direction where we can, and it would be absolutely our preferred situation in every space. The only thing I would say about it is that the corollary, I guess, is that, you know, we mean it when we talk about community community stewardship and community governance. And that can sort of reveal itself in lots of different ways. But there are absolutely times when it's appropriate to create an ownership model, to work with an ownership model that reflects that community governance and stewardship component as well. So in Daniel's Spectrum, which is our new Arts and Cultural Centre in Regent Park, we have a tortuous, and I will not bore you with it, but I can tell you later if you're interested, but a tortuous and complex ownership model for that was absolutely put in place to reflect the shared stewardship commitment in that community going forward between ourselves, Toronto Community Housing, the Daniels Corporation, and the community. So there's also a degree to which those things kind of override, you know, those other concerns. But yeah, I mean, anchoring artists in physical space in the long term, in gentrifying, difficult world, in revitalizing communities is a really big concern of ours going forward, absolutely. Can you introduce yourself?
Certainly. Teresa Byrne, City of Calgary. Question for you. In terms of then getting access to your facilities or to your spaces, what is the criteria, or how do you then select who can get access?
So there are, I guess, two things to say about that. I mean, the first thing is to say that we use we have some parameters for what we mean by artist, which is a pretty broad parameter, but we are looking for people who are interested in working in our spaces, if they're cultural organizations, to evidence some longevity, and if they're individual artists, to evidence that they are practicing professional artists of some kind. And we use the draft Canadian Artists Code as a sort of broad guideline for that. But I think the really important thing to say about it, you know, from my perspective, is that as we have evolved into developing these more kind of complex projects, which are absolutely about, you know, the place and the community they're in and the vision for what those projects can achieve in a community, you know, is really what drives the whole piece. What we now do when we go out to do the formal tenanting process, so when we call for tenants, we specifically through that process require that applicants don't just tell us about their practice and their work and complete all the other requirements. We require that they tell us what they are going to deliver into the community, into that project vision. So, you know, we are no longer, and this is possibly a loss as well. I mean, it's all a kind of complicated balance sheet. You know, in a sense, it's no longer enough for an artist to come into a studio and shut the door and work there. We need to understand that if it's an individual practitioner or if it's a cultural organization or another organization, we increasingly have other kinds of not-for-profits in our properties who have sort of synergistic missions and values. We need them to say, this is what we will be contributing to the vision for this project. So then there's a sort of juried selection process for all of that, but that's really at the heart of where we're trying to go now with our projects. I think we've probably got time for one more. There's a hand up at the back.
Hi, I'm Colin Wigginton from the City of Kingston. I had a question actually for Gabe. I wondered if you could speak briefly about those various websites you were referencing that are inspirational to you. We've just started to do some mobile app development for our own sort of typical heritage tours, and members of the community are coming forward saying we have content too. And now suddenly we're finding ourselves in a gatekeeper role, and I'm wondering if there's ways that we can get out of the way, direct people to sites that they can develop their own content and help tell stories without having to work through the city.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a pretty big challenge. I would say it's not one that there is an off-the-shelf technology solution to, but I think that technology can, in particular, I think the first one I showed is called, the website is Open Plans, and they offer a few different different systems that help facilitate a sort of online collaboration in a way that might be appropriate for what you're talking about. There are probably other similar ones as well. I do think that it's a challenging process, not only because you've got different people in the community with different perspectives and different voices, but then you have the additional sort of complexity of what's the appropriate technology, who is this for, how do we make sure it's accessible. Those are really difficult questions to answer, and I think that it's important to not try to solve them all at the same time. And actually take a sort of iterative approach where through a series of pilots and experiments that you're able to try out different approaches and make sure that you're learning from those along the way. So I mean that's an honest answer.
Okay, well, I think it's time for us to wrap this up and hand it back to Dennis. So thank you all for listening to us, and let me thank Jim and Gabe on your behalf as well for coming out today.